August 15th, 1945. The day Japan's surrender was announced to the world, a day wrapped in radio static, solemn voices, and the surreal collapse of an empire. Across the Pacific, men and women reeled at the thought that the war was finally over. But for a small group of young women, the day did not bring freedom. It began with the sound of boots crunching gravel, the harsh glare of morning sun through bamboo slats, and the command to march. Their destination, an American prison camp. Their expectation, cruelty beyond imagining. They had been told stories, whispered in barracks and shouted in military indoctrination halls, that Americans were demons, barbaric, merciless, inhuman. The Japanese officers who controlled their lives insisted that surrender to the Allies was worse than death. The girls, many not yet 20, some no older than 15, carried these warnings like a curse. They had already endured unspeakable years as comfort girls, a term that sounded gentle but hid the grim machinery of forced service for Japanese soldiers. To them, the war had been fought not in grand battles, but in small, windowless rooms where dignity was stripped away hour by hour. Now, as their captors retreated and the Americans advanced, they braced for an even darker fate. The march toward the camp was slow, heavy with silence. Their bodies were thin, legs shaking under the weight of exhaustion. Each step carried them farther from what they knew, even if what they knew was cruelty, and closer to an unknown shaped entirely by fear. Some clutched rags around their shoulders, remnants of dresses that had once been brightly patterned. Others carried nothing at all, having lost even their meager possessions in the chaos of retreat. The guards who escorted them, Japanese soldiers surrendering themselves along with the girls, kept their heads low, defeated, their rifles slung without conviction. For the first time, captor and captive shared the same destination, the same dread of what awaited behind foreign barbed wire. At the camp gates, the women's hearts raced. They expected snarling dogs, shouts, perhaps the immediate violence of men who had every reason to hate them. Instead, they saw a peculiar sight, an American soldier with freckles balancing a wicker basket in his arms. Oranges, their skins bright and almost glowing in the sun, spilled over the top. One rolled to the ground, bumping against a woman's foot. She froze, waiting for a blow, but the soldier only stooped, picked it up, and grinned sheepishly before tucking it back in. The moment was absurd, almost insulting. Could this be the cruelty they had feared? The camp itself did not look like the abyss they had imagined. Barbed wire coiled along the perimeter, yes, and wooden watchtowers loomed with rifles pointed outward. But inside, order replaced chaos. Rows of tents stood neatly, smoke rose from a kitchen fire, and a long table was set with metal trays. The smell that reached them was not blood or rot, but stew, thick, meaty, carried by a breeze that made more than one's stomach clench with longing. For months, their meals had been little more than scraps, sometimes just a handful of rice crust. Now, against every warning they had been fed, there was food. One girl, no older than 16, whispered under her breath, "This is a trick." Another nodded vigorously. They had been conditioned to believe kindness was camouflage, a trap laid before the inevitable cruelty. And so, when they were offered soap and told to bathe, they looked around in terror, half expecting scalding water or some hidden humiliation. Instead, they found buckets of warm water, rough towels, and the smell of lye that stung but promised cleanliness. One of them, clutching the bar of soap, began to laugh, a nervous, high-pitched laugh that quickly turned into sobs. She had forgotten what it meant to feel clean. The guards were stern but not cruel. They shouted commands in English, most of which the women could not understand, but the tone lacked the menace they knew too well. When one stumbled and fell, an American soldier extended his hand. She recoiled at first, expecting it to be withdrawn or tightened in punishment. Instead, he waited patiently until she placed her trembling palm in his, and he pulled her gently to her feet. It was a simple gesture, yet it lodged itself in her memory like a stone dropped in still water. That night, as they lay on cots lined in rows inside a tent, the women whispered to each other. Was this the calm before the storm? Would the masks fall away tomorrow? The shadows of the tent flickered with lantern light, and beyond the thin canvas they heard the muffled voices of soldiers talking, laughing softly. Some words were familiar. Home, mother, Christmas. Words of ordinary life, words that belonged to another universe entirely. For the women, it was almost unbearable to hear men speak of mothers with tenderness when their own had sent them off with tears and shame, never to be seen again. Still, fear clung to them. When a soldier delivered blankets, one woman refused to touch hers, convinced it was poisoned. Another sat rigid all night, staring at the tent flap, waiting for horror to enter. Survival had trained them to doubt everything, even mercy. And yet, beneath the fear, something else stirred, a dangerous, fragile hope. The next morning, breakfast was ladled out into tin bowls, oatmeal sweetened with sugar. Sugar. The crystalline taste on their tongues was so foreign that a few gagged, unable to believe it was meant to be eaten. One girl tried to hoard hers, tucking it under the cot, only to find it crawling with ants an hour later. The absurdity of it made the others laugh, a brittle sound that was half joy, half disbelief. For days they searched for cracks in the facade. Surely, they thought, the cruelty would emerge, perhaps in the punishments for mistakes, perhaps in the shadows of night. But no whips came, no boots kicked. Instead, there was structure, roll calls, work details, medical inspections. The Americans, it seemed, were determined not to mirror the empire that had enslaved them. To the women, this contrast was more unsettling than any blow. They could not reconcile it. Why would enemies offer them care when their own countrymen had offered only suffering? The conflict took root in their hearts, distrust fighting with the first sparks of relief. They did not yet understand that what they were witnessing was not a trick but a policy, an American commitment, however imperfect, to uphold the Geneva Convention and prove moral superiority over their defeated foe. They only knew that the world they expected had not appeared. Instead of barbarism, they had found order. Instead of hatred, a kind of detached courtesy. Instead of hell, something uncomfortably close to kindness. As the sun set on their third night in the camp, the women sat in silence, listening to the faint strains of a harmonica drifting from a guard post. The music was clumsy, off-key, almost comical. Yet it carried through the still air like a reminder that humanity, absurd and stubborn, had survived the war. The women did not sing along, but something within them shifted. The iron certainty of their fear had cracked, replaced by questions more terrifying than answers. If the Americans were not the monsters, then who had been? The harmonica trailed off, and night wrapped itself around the camp. The women closed their eyes, but their sleep was restless. They had entered this place expecting cruelty, prepared for death. What they found was something far stranger, something they could neither trust nor dismiss. And deep within, a thought began to stir, a thought so dangerous it felt like betrayal. What if kindness was real? The first light of morning spilled over the barbed wire, glinting on the metal like 100 tiny suns. From their cots inside the canvas tents, the women stirred slowly, their bodies stiff from the unaccustomed softness of mattresses that were too forgiving after years of sleeping on boards or dirt. For a moment, they did not move. The fear of waking into cruelty still clung to them, heavier than any blanket. They listened. No whips cracked, no boots pounded the ground in rage. Instead, there was a whistle, shrill but almost playful, marking the beginning of the day. They shuffled outside into the cool air, blinking against the brightness. A line had already formed near the mess hall, a shack built of wood planks that smelled faintly of sawdust. Smoke curled from its chimney, carrying with it the scent of coffee so bitter it made some wrinkle their noses, and bread whose yeasty aroma drew their empty stomachs into knots of longing. An American corporal, his sleeves rolled high on muscled arms, ladled out portions with the indifference of routine. To him, this was nothing more than a duty. To the women, it was a bewildering theater of abundance. They received trays of scrambled eggs, toast and watery milk. At first, they stared, convinced there had been some mistake. One girl, thin as a reed and no more than 17, tried to hand hers back, muttering that she could not pay. The soldier frowned, pushed it into her hands again, and gestured firmly toward the benches. She sat, trembling, then tasted the eggs. The soft texture, the richness of salt and butter, foreign luxuries, made her eyes widen. Tears slid down her face before she could stop them. The others watched in silence, then, as if a dam had broken, began to eat with the desperation of the starving. Later that morning, they were lined up in a yard where sunlight turned the gravel into white fire. A medic strode past them, clipboard in hand, his stethoscope dangling like an ornament of authority. One by one, he inspected them. He lifted chins, checked eyes, pressed fingers against thin wrists to feel for pulses that fluttered like frightened birds. Some women flinched, expecting violation, but his touch was clinical, brisk, impersonal. When he noticed lesions or fever, he scribbled notes and sent them toward the infirmary, a clean building where white sheets and the sharp scent of alcohol replaced the stench of decay they had known in military brothels. For many, it was the first time in years their health had been anyone's concern. One Korean girl, her body ravaged by untreated infections, could not understand why doctors hovered around her bed with needles and bottles of medicine. She whispered to a neighbor, "They heal prisoners?" For what purpose? The question was never answered, yet the medicine worked. Her fever broke. She slept for days without nightmares, and when she awoke, she cried not from pain, but from the shocking absence of it. Life in the camp followed rhythms. There were chores, sweeping tents, peeling potatoes, hauling buckets. The women labored quietly, grateful for the predictability. Predictability itself was a mercy. The Japanese military had trained them to brace for sudden brutality, for violence that could erupt from silence. Here, silence meant rest. The clang of the dinner bell meant food, not terror. Even the barking of orders, though sharp, lacked the venom they were used to. At night, lanterns lit the pathways, and the women lay on cots listening to the sounds of men, American guards talking, laughing, sometimes singing. Once, a group of soldiers sat near the fence strumming guitars, their voices carrying old folk songs into the darkness. The women huddled together, listening in secret. The lyrics meant nothing to them, but the melodies stirred something strange, an ache for beauty they had nearly forgotten existed. One woman whispered, "They sing as though the war never touched them." Another replied, "Maybe this is how they forget." Their voices fell quiet after that, but the songs lingered in their memories, like shadows of a life they could barely imagine for themselves. The contrast between expectation and reality gnawed at them. Propaganda had painted Americans as monsters who would torture, enslave, or slaughter. Yet the men they saw were young, sometimes clumsy, sometimes kind without thinking. One soldier offered chewing gum to a girl who eyed it suspiciously, then tried to use it to wash her hands, thinking it soap. The soldier burst out laughing, not cruelly but with surprise, and gently showed her how to chew. She blushed, half in shame, half in amusement, and soon the other girls were laughing too. It was a rare moment of levity, and though it passed quickly, it hinted at something none of them dared trust. Humanity could surface in the most unlikely places. Still, the camp was not paradise. Barbed wire reminded them daily that they were not free. Guards with rifles patrolled the perimeter, watchtowers loomed, and there were punishments for disobedience. One evening, a woman tried to slip past the gate in search of her brother, rumored to be in another camp. She was caught. The Americans did not beat her, but they confined her alone in a tent for 2 nights with nothing but bread and water. The loneliness was punishment enough. When she returned, the others whispered anxiously, half relieved she had not been executed, half reminded that kindness did not erase captivity. Letters were offered, though few had addresses to write to. Some scribbled names of villages destroyed by bombs, others wrote to mothers who had likely already mourned them as dead. A few never picked up the pencils at all, refusing to believe there was anyone left to read their words. Yet the option itself was bewildering. In their minds, Enemies did not grant such luxuries. Day by day, the women's bodies began to change. Hollow cheeks filled out, bones no longer jutted as sharply under skin. Their hair, once brittle and falling in clumps, grew softer with regular washing. For the first time in years, their faces reflected something other than terror. They began to resemble the girls they had been before the war stole their youth. But inside, the transformation was slower. Fear lingered like a shadow that refused to fade, whispering that every kindness had a hidden cost. Conversations at night revealed this struggle. One woman confessed she still woke expecting the heavy tread of Japanese boots outside her door. Another admitted she dreamed of escape, not because she feared the Americans, but because she could not bear to rely on their mercy. Dependence was its own humiliation. They were not citizens here, not daughters or sisters, not even recognized as victims. They were prisoners, and the kindness they received was filtered through the bars of captivity. The Americans, for their part, rarely looked at the women with pity. To them, these were simply civilians caught in the machinery of war. A chaplain once stopped to speak with a group, offering them Bibles they could not read. He smiled kindly, but the gesture fell into silence, neither side knowing how to bridge the abyss of language and history between them. Later, one woman kept the small black book under her pillow, not for its words, but for the strangeness of being given something with no demand in return. Yet beneath the routines, a deeper conflict brewed. The women began to ask themselves the unthinkable. Had their empire lied to them all along? If the Americans were not the demons, then who were the true monsters? This thought was too dangerous to say aloud, but it lingered in the spaces between sentences, in the way they sometimes looked at each other with haunted eyes. Truth, once cracked, could not easily be mended. Winter came early that year. Frost coated the camp fences, turning the wire into silver lace. The women huddled in coats too large for their frames, donated from American supplies. One night, snow fell heavy and silent, blanketing the camp in stillness. A guard left his post to brush snow from the steps of the women's barracks. They watched from inside, stunned by the simple act. One murmured, "Why would he care if we slip?" The question had no answer, but it tightened something in their chests. Small gestures could feel heavier than the largest betrayals. The paradox of the camp deepened with every passing day. Captivity laced with unexpected mercy, foreignness softened by moments of recognition. The women laughed at small mistakes, cried at sudden memories, and slowly learned to live in a place that was neither freedom nor hell. And yet, for all the food, the warmth, the safety, they remained restless. The gates still barred them from the world, and beyond those gates lay families who might never welcome them back, nations already rewriting the story of the war. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and shadows stretched across the compound, a woman sat at the edge of the yard, staring at the wire. Her voice was barely a whisper, but those nearest heard her. Perhaps kindness is the cruelest thing of all. It makes us hope the words sank into silence, chilling more than the frost in the air. For kindness could heal the body, but it also forced the women to confront wounds far deeper, wounds that no prison camp, however merciful, could mend. And as the guards changed shifts, lanterns flickering to life on the towers, the women lay down once more, torn between suspicion and longing. They had begun to taste the sweetness of survival, but survival was not the same as freedom. Tomorrow promised more food, more order, more bewildering gestures of care. But what waited beyond the gates, when they were finally opened, was a question none dared answer. Night in the camp had a way of stretching into eternity. The women lay awake on their cots, the lanterns outside casting shifting shadows against the canvas walls, the crackle of frost on the ground, and the low murmur of guards trading stories by the fence mingled with the restless hum of memory. Sleep, when it came, was fractured. One woman woke screaming from a dream where boots thundered through her barracks. Another curled in on herself, whispering apologies to a mother who might never forgive her. The darkness was filled not with silence, but with the echoes of a war that refused to end. It was not the hunger that haunted them now, nor the lash of cruelty they had expected. It was the unbearable gentleness. A soldier setting down an extra slice of bread, a medic wrapping a bandage with quiet care, a chaplain offering a smile. Each act struck like a stone against glass, cracking the stories they had been forced to believe. Their own officers had promised that Americans would defile, torture, and kill them. Yet the only blows were invisible, the sudden collapse of certainty, the slow unmasking of betrayal. During roll call one morning, frost still clinging to the edges of their breath, one of the younger women asked aloud, "Why do they not hurt us?" The words were meant to be whispered, but in the cold air they carried, reaching ears that stiffened in silence. No one answered. No one could. The question lingered like smoke, curling into their minds, impossible to dispel. The contradiction became sharper with every passing day. They had endured years as commodities in brothels, sanctioned by their own empire, their bodies reduced to rations for exhausted soldiers. Now, in a camp guarded by supposed enemies, their humanity was acknowledged in ways so ordinary it felt almost cruel. A bowl of soup handed without violence, a guard pausing to steady an old woman's steps. The smallest gestures burned the deepest, because they forced the women to measure the abyss between how they had been treated by their own countrymen and how they were treated by strangers. At times, the memories rose unbidden. One woman, scar on her cheek from an officer's backhand, would sit by the fence staring into the distance until another shook her from her trance. She told no stories, but her silence said enough. Another confessed, in broken whispers one night, that she could not stand the sound of footsteps, because every step reminded her of the soldiers who once lined outside her door, waiting their turn. The others nodded, each carrying her own private collection of ghosts. Trauma made them kin, but kindness from their captors made them strangers to themselves. The Americans, for all their gestures, did not truly see them. To the guards, they were simply civilians swept into war's tide, not symbols of exploitation. The men offered food, blankets, sometimes clumsy attempts at friendliness, but they did not understand the raw wounds behind the women's cautious eyes. And yet, even without knowing, they reshaped the women's inner landscapes. The absence of cruelty was itself transformative, but it also left a vacuum, an emptiness where rage had been, now filled with confusion too heavy to carry. One evening, near Christmas, the chaplain organized a gathering. He strung paper decorations across the mess hall, and soldiers hummed carols while handing out sweets. The women sat in a corner, watching as the room filled with laughter foreign to them. One soldier, perhaps barely 19, offered a candy cane to a girl who stared at it as if it were a weapon. She accepted it finally, tasted its sharp sweetness, and for the first time in years, smiled without bitterness. Yet even as her lips curved upward, her eyes brimmed with tears. Joy felt like betrayal. To laugh in an enemy's camp while memories of suffering still throbbed was unbearable, and yet the laughter slipped out anyway, cracking the walls she had built around herself. That night, lying in her cot, she whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore." Her words found resonance among others who admitted the same. They were neither free nor enslaved, neither hated nor loved. Suspended in a limbo of mercy, they were forced to reckon with an identity shattered by war. Humor sometimes surfaced as a lifeline. A soldier once demonstrated how to use a fork properly, amused when one girl continued to stab her bread as though it were an enemy. The laughter that followed was awkward, hesitant, but real. Another time, an American mispronounced a Korean phrase he had overheard, and the women collapsed in giggles, the absurdity of the moment erasing, if only briefly, the heaviness of the past. These moments mattered, not because they erased pain, but because they proved it was still possible to feel something other than fear. But healing was never linear. For every step toward trust, there was a stumble back into suspicion. One woman refused to eat for days, convinced the food must be poisoned. Another resisted treatment for illness, certain the medicine was an experiment. Their wounds were not only of the body, but of belief itself. To accept kindness meant admitting they had been deceived by their own leaders. That betrayal cut deeper than any lash. The guards noticed the hesitance but could not fathom its roots. For them, discipline and humanity were policy, codified by the Geneva Convention. For the women, they were uncharted territory. Each day became a negotiation between past and present, the hand that once struck them replaced by one that now offered warmth. Could both be real? If so, which truth should they hold on to? One evening, as snow drifted against the wire, a soldier played a harmonica near the guard post. The melody was uneven, childlike, but it carried a softness that wrapped the camp in something resembling peace. The women listened in silence, some closing their eyes as if to absorb it. One murmured, "Even music was taken from us. And now it returns from them." The irony stung. They wanted to hate the sound, but instead it lingered in their bones like warmth after frost. Slowly, an ideological reckoning began. They spoke less of the cruelty they feared and more of the cruelty they had endured at home. Whispered admissions surfaced. The Americans are not the monsters. Perhaps it was our own who lied. These thoughts were dangerous, for to admit them was to unravel years of indoctrination. Yet once spoken, they could not be silenced. Truth spread quietly, like fire catching in dry grass. Still, the questions never left. If the Americans showed mercy, did it absolve them of the bombs that had leveled cities, the firestorms that had claimed families? Could kindness in captivity coexist with destruction beyond the wire? The women wrestled with contradictions that offered no easy answers. Mercy and massacre, compassion and cruelty, both were true, and holding them together was like carrying a blade without a sheath. The emotional reckoning did not lead to peace, it led to restlessness. The women could no longer cling to the certainty of hatred, nor could they embrace the comfort of trust. They existed in a fragile in-between, their hearts torn between suspicion and gratitude, grief and hope. At times, the burden of kindness was heavier than cruelty. Cruelty at least had clarity. Kindness demanded forgiveness, and forgiveness was harder than survival. One night, as lanterns flickered and snow pressed against the canvas walls, a young woman whispered into the dark, "What if kindness is only a trick of war? A mask until they no longer need it?" Silence followed, heavy and unresolved. The others listened, each trapped in the same tension, the desire to believe and the terror of being deceived again. The camp was quiet, save for the distant hum of the harmonica. The women closed their eyes, their thoughts circling like restless birds. They had begun to see that cruelty was not inevitable, that even enemies could be capable of gentleness. But knowing this only sharpened the wound left by those who should have protected them. The truth was not freedom. It was a reckoning, and reckoning cut deeper than chains. And so, as dawn threatened once more beyond the barbed wire, the women lay in a liminal space caught between past and future. They had survived brutality, and now they faced the unbearable weight of compassion. Yet what lay beyond the camp's gates, when the world finally demanded their return, remained an unanswered question. The bars could not keep them forever. And when they opened, mercy itself might prove the cruelest deception of all. The gates opened not with fanfare, but with the groan of hinges and the bark of orders translated through gestures. Snow had begun to melt in the low sun of early spring, leaving mud along the fence posts where women once stood staring outward. They were told they could leave. Freedom, so long whispered as an impossible dream, had arrived with none of the drama they imagined. There were no parades, no rejoicing crowds, just the bewildering fact that the barbed wire no longer held them. Some women stepped forward quickly, as if afraid the permission would be revoked. Others lingered, staring at the guards who had fed and clothed them, their hearts tangled in contradictions they could not untangle. The return to their homelands was a journey lined with silence. Trucks rumbled across broken roads, carrying them back to villages scarred by fire and loss. Faces pressed against wooden slats, they watched fields littered with rubble, homes reduced to skeletons of beams, and people moving like shadows, scavenging for food. No one cheered their arrival. No one even noticed. To many of those waiting in villages, The war's end was not victory, but survival at its thinnest thread. And these women, thin, tired, carrying the weight of shame, were not welcomed as survivors, but branded as reminders of humiliation. One girl, scarcely 18, returned to a house where only her younger brother remained. Their mother had died, their father executed for defiance against the Japanese. The boy stared at her in disbelief, then looked away. "You should not have come back," he whispered before shutting the door. She did not knock again. The cruelty of family cut deeper than any prison camp fence, and she understood in that instant that the shame of survival was her new captivity. Others found themselves wandering towns where neighbors looked through them as if they were ghosts. They carried the stench of war in their silence, and the rumors of what they had been forced to do followed them like smoke. Words such as tainted and fallen clung to them. Men who had once courted them turned away in disgust. Mothers warned their daughters not to stand near them, as though disgrace were contagious. Some women denied everything, inventing stories of factory work or service as nurses. Others said nothing at all, sealing their past into a silence that strangled them from within. The strange kindness of the Americans became a double-edged memory. When they tried to describe their time in the camps, they were met with disbelief. "How can you say such things?" "They are the enemy," families insisted, but the women remembered bowls of soup, blankets in winter, the way a soldier stooped to help them rise. That memory grew sharper when compared to the indifference they now faced at home. The paradox consumed them. They had been shown humanity by those who were supposed to hate them and rejected by those who were supposed to love them. Not all succumbed to silence. In Korea, some women attempted to testify during post-war tribunals, hoping their voices might pierce the noise of propaganda. They spoke hesitantly of the brothels, the disease, the terror, and then, almost apologetically, of the camps where Americans had treated them with a dignity they had thought lost forever. Yet such words rarely made it into records. History was already being shaped by victors who needed clear lines, the enemy cruel, the allies merciful, the victims pure. These women's testimonies did not fit neatly, for they blurred the boundaries between victim and survivor, enemy and savior. And so their words were set aside, buried beneath the convenient silence of official memory. Still, in private, their stories persisted. A woman in the Philippines would later tell her granddaughter of the day an American medic pressed a cool cloth to her fevered head, his eyes tired but kind. Another in Korea remembered chewing gum offered by a laughing soldier, its sweetness staying on her tongue like an impossible dream. They told these fragments not to glorify captivity, but to remind themselves that even in the wreckage of war, humanity flickered. That flicker, however faint, had kept them alive long enough to see the gates open. Years passed, and the women aged into lives of invisibility. Many never married, their names left out of family registers. Some became widows without ever having been brides. They carried the weight of their youth in silence, their memories pressed into the corners of their minds like fragile artifacts that no one wished to handle. Yet in their solitude, they also carried a secret strength, the knowledge that they had endured the unbearable, and that survival, however scorned, was still defiance. One woman, who had once been 16 when taken, kept a photograph folded deep in her clothing until the day she died. It showed her standing awkwardly in the camp, smiling faintly beside 2 American guards, a loaf of bread cradled in her arms like a trophy. The photo had been taken by a Red Cross worker who passed through, documenting conditions. For her, that bread was more than food. It was proof that she had been seen, if only for a moment, as something other than a tool. Her children found the photograph after her death, confused by the foreign uniforms. They asked why she had kept it. None of them knew how to explain the complexity of a smile captured in a prison. History, too, struggled with that complexity. In textbooks, comfort women were mentioned briefly, often with numbers that blurred their individual faces into statistics. The American camps rarely appeared at all, erased by a narrative that favored stark contrasts. Allied liberators, Axis oppressors. The nuance that some women had found more humanity in captivity than in so-called protection was a truth too jagged to fit into official accounts. And so the silence thickened, decades deep. But silence is never permanent. In the late 20th century, survivors began to speak publicly, their trembling voices cutting through the fog of denial. They stood before cameras, in courtrooms in front of students, and confessed what had been forced upon them. Some spoke of Japanese brutality in detail, so raw it silenced rooms. Others, more cautiously, mentioned the unexpected kindness of American camps, careful not to let gratitude be mistaken for forgetting. Their testimonies shocked younger generations who had been raised on simpler narratives. The women's voices revealed not only the cruelty of war, but its strange ironies, that enemies could be gentle and allies could abandon. The legacy of their reckoning remains tangled. For those who endured, kindness was not a salvation, but a wound of its own. It forced them to see their own empire's lies, to question loyalties drilled into them since childhood. It left them with a gratitude they could not voice and a shame they could not shake. They lived between worlds, belonging fully to none, their identities fractured by contradictions. And yet, in that fracture, there was also resilience. They bore witness not only to suffering, but to the stubborn endurance of compassion. In the final years of their lives, some survivors chose to tell everything, stripping away the silence they had worn like armor. One Korean woman, interviewed in the 1990s, recalled in a trembling voice, "We expected the Americans to be monsters. But when they gave us soap, when they gave us food, I realized the monsters were the ones who had sent us there." Her words fell with the weight of revelation, reshaping not just her own story, but the stories of those who listened. And still, the question lingered. What was freedom truly? For the women who left the camps, freedom meant walking into societies that had no place for them. It meant carrying memories that no court could prosecute, no reparations could heal. Freedom was survival without recognition, life without belonging. Yet they carried it anyway, because to survive was to defy those who had tried to erase them. The story of their captivity did not end at the gates of the camp. It lingered in their children's hesitant questions, in photographs folded into secret drawers, in the trembling lines of memoirs written decades later. It lingers now in the silence between statistics and testimony, in the space where official history falters and human memory refuses to be neat. In the end, the legacy is neither simple nor triumphant. It is a knot of grief and irony, resilience and shame. These women walked into American camps expecting to meet cruelty and instead met a mirror reflecting the betrayal of their own empire. That revelation became both their burden and their strength. It fractured their understanding of the world, but also gave them proof that humanity could survive even in war's darkest corners. The photograph remains. Women standing awkwardly, smiles hesitant, bread in their hands, guards in the background. To the untrained eye, it is nothing more than a relic. But to those who know, it is evidence of a moment when survival took on a face, when cruelty was interrupted by mercy, when history bent briefly toward compassion. And so, the gates of memory remain open, long after the fences have rusted away. The women are gone now, their voices fading into archives, their stories filtered through translators and historians. But their reckoning endures, a reminder that war is not only battles and treaties, but also the quiet, bewildering spaces where enemies choose not to hate. What came after the gates, though, the rejection at home, the silence of history, the struggle to be believed, was a prison no guard could open. And that is where the story ends, not in liberation, but in a question that still waits in the cold air. When kindness comes from an enemy and cruelty from one's own, where does loyalty belong, and what does freedom truly mean?